Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of openDemocracy, and we have a completely fantastic panel for you today. Thank you to all the panelists who are joining. Emily Bell from the Tow Centre for Journalism at Columbia University. We've got Anoa Changa, who's joining us from Atlanta, Georgia. She's a journalist who covers electoral justice, amongst other issues. We have Josh Rudolph, who has a very cool job title. He's fellow for Malign Finance at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. And we have our very own investigations editor, Peter Geoghegan. So I'm really delighted we're getting the opportunity to have this discussion today on day one of President Biden's administration. It's incredibly well timed. And I'll just share that, over the past, since October, so over the past few months, I've been traveling all across the US through the Midwest and in some of the southern states. And I can tell you firsthand that there's a bit of a problem with the information ecosystem. I've spoken with people who tell me that the riot and occupation of the Capitol building on the 6th of January was an operation planned by the FBI or the CIA. I have heard every conspiracy theory and variation of it going, from the stolen election to QAnon to the fact that apparently wearing masks does not protect you from COVID, and it actually makes you more likely to die of it. All this disinformation is not something I went looking for. It's something that happens when you speak to people in red states and in blue states all across the country. And so I would love to hand this over to Emily. First of all, Emily Bell, what are we going to do about this? Over to you. We'll sort this problem in the next 55 minutes, yeah?
Thanks, Mary. I feel like I should not be the person commenting on this because, like you, I am British, but I have been working on this some of these issues here in New York at Columbia for the past 10 years, and so just to sort of describe the problem a little bit from the angle that we're looking at it, which is really just about news and information. I think there are so many things underneath the umbrella of disinformation or misinformation, which are actually about much more kind of profound fractures in society, which need a kind of holistic approach, which goes way beyond the ambit of people working in journalism schools. But the news. I mean, so what happened in 2016? Was that you suddenly, as a result of the fake news scandal and the idea that the Russians may or may not have interfered in an American election by targeting, particular communities, the African American community, communities in narrow, in purple states where there's a swing vote. With all kinds of things, not just kind of ads or posts, but also conversation, also events, etc. That wasn't a surprise to a lot of us who'd been, if you like, pressing the alarm on you've built a communication system, particularly within these large scale, unaccountable tech companies, where you have no idea which audiences are being told what. We have no way of interrogating that. It's a new system of power, which is both enabling new voices, but also stopping a real sort of interrogation of what's actually going on. And so if you imagine kind of like the shock that everybody felt who haven't really been paying attention, including, it turns out, the leadership of Facebook, when the kind of the lid on that particular can of worms was peeled back. In the past 4 years have been this rapid, but that they have been a necessary but not sufficient learning curve to understand how those techniques, those deficiencies and those fractures were actually happening here in the United States, and actually in all kinds of countries, in democratic and non-democratic countries around the world. We see the same thing over and over again. And it is an alignment of power and money and media. And I know you have a lot of people kind of on the call from the UK. I was just going back and reading a lot about the phone hacking scandal and Rupert Murdoch's sort of companies being involved in that. their involvement at the same time in the electoral process in 2009, you know, their pushing of a kind of a pro-Brexit agenda. And, you know, here we saw this alignment, if you like, of things that should be accountability mechanisms. So, you know, the press should be an accountability mechanism. Fox News was not an accountability mechanism. It was a distributor of propaganda and misinformation. The social platforms were not an accountability mechanism. They were places where harassment, targeting of kind of, you know, sort of truth-based populations became rife. They were sort of that they had designed that themselves to be almost kind of impenetrable to the kind of threatening discourse and misinformation and harassment and attacks that actually make free exchange of ideas and democracy quite difficult to work. And it's no different if you look at Duterte in the Philippines, who kind of in some ways wrote the playbook for this, as did, you know, Putin in Russia, as is Modi in India at the moment. You know, as I say, this is actually just something that we understand is happening. And at the same time, you have, you know, if you like, the kind of the civil society activist organizations and the journalism organizations, which are truth-based and, you know, pro-democratic, as a sort of an inadequate bulwark against a lot of that. Now, democracy has prevailed, we could say. You know, we had an election which, but for America to come so close to having violent conflict around the results of a perfectly legitimate election is too close. And it was, you know, again, we've seen this pattern in the past in all kinds of places, you know, Japan, Germany in the 30s, where you have, you know, kind of sort of failed coups which can be dismissed because they are amateurish and they are, you know, kind of populated by grifters and people exploiting the very worst of human nature. But what we also should learn from history is that if you don't do something about it, those, you know, those divisions are fed, those kind of coups become more and more professional, and eventually they end up in a kind of authoritarianism and repression that you think is unthinkable in the United States, but actually it's not. You know, the United States has been pretty good at oppressing large parts of its population. What do we do about it? I mean, I think there's a great paper from PEN America out this week, which has a sort of an agenda for rebuilding, you know, so democratic sort of accountability institutions, which goes, and the interesting thing about the paper and, you know, some of the work that we've been doing, so we're looking at dark money in local news, and how hyper-partisan money is now kind of creeping into where you have a vacuum of local information. You know, I was talking to an editor, or, you know, the other day, who was saying, you know, he's somebody who situates himself more on the right than he does on the left, and he was saying, it terrifies me that when I say to my group of friends there was nothing wrong with the election, they can't believe that that is a belief I hold. And somehow we have to sort of get to a point where, you know, we can disagree about our ideologies, but we have to be able to share this sort of fundamental trust in the truth. And you know, kind of, I think that it is, Tim Snyder wrote a great piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, where he laid out, you know, kind of all the sort of the problems with American democracy at the moment. He singled out, you know, local journalism as being weak. It's something that, you know, we see disappearing from communities. Some communities it has never served very well. We've done a lot of research in Philadelphia around how actually kind of, you know, urban non-white communities feel that journalism has never helped them. It's been something that's happened to them. It's not something that they've been involved in, and it tells, you know, kind of stories about communities that they don't recognize. So the idea that we have to tackle everything from literacy, through to media support, through to platform regulation, through to, policy frameworks. There are no policy frameworks around this. Can feel like an overwhelming task, but I think, the scare of the 6th of January has removed, if you like, the last sort of remaining barrier to this, which is political will. So what I really hope is that things like the policy recommendations of Penn, the policy recommendations that are coming out of other places as well, actually, meet an administration which has the courage to tackle some of the sort of commercial, the kind of commercial shibboleths of the American information economy. The free market is not going to fix this, so we have to have, a program to do that.
And can you just pick out a few of those Penn recommendations, just for people who haven't read it, or what do you think are the most sort of nothing's easy.
Sure.
The things that jump out at you is like, this is actually what needs to happen now.
So I would obviously go straight to the endorse an independent commission to revitalize local journalism, because that's these are my people. That's what I would advocate for. I think that some kind of recognition that you can't just fight misinformation. Fighting misinformation has become a sort of a convenient label, often propagated actually by places like Facebook and Google, to say we're doing something about this. But I agree with academics like Dan Kreis at UNC, who's said in the past, we talk about fighting misinformation because we don't want to talk about racism. We talk about fighting misinformation because we don't want to talk about information. We don't want to talk about income inequality. So that, I think that was a strong recommendation. I think reasserting the America as a place that defends press freedom and freedom of expression, and does that domestically and around the world, is actually an important and very doable objective for the Biden administration. I think also, kind of setting up a commission that really focuses on the kind of disinformation, everything from a program for media literacy. There are very mixed views about media literacy. But I think that, kind of just the idea that we should know more about our information environment is absolutely imperative. And then something that I would add, which actually isn't on the kind of Penn necessarily sort of slate of action, is urgent regulation of the platforms in this environment, even if it is just to add European style requirements, or potential European style requirements. If you look at the sort of proposed DSA legislation at the moment that says, if you're a platform, you should be able to evaluate what the risks are that your platforms are creating. What is it you're doing about it? Do you have adequately paid and trained moderation resource? Have you identified those things, and can you kind of account for them? And if you can't and don't, then there will be penalties attached. And I think that's a kind of a minimum. We could, antitrust is the tool that I think a lot of, American sort of lawyers see as being a better route. But I think that, there are certain things around regulation of speech, which people need to see separately, or rather as enhancing the First Amendment rather than being a threat to it, which is, you don't have freedom of speech if you have an alignment of very powerful media interests and authoritarianism. You actually have oppression of free speech. And that is something which, America has not wanted to address head on, and I think is now going to have to.
Thank you. Anna, I wanted to come to you next, actually, because I wanted you to pick up Emily's point about local journalism and who journalism currently serves, and where the gaps are, and sort of pick up those themes and reflect on them as you see them.
I mean, Emily took all the amazing points. We obviously read the same stuff because PEN America has been one of my go-tos this cycle as well. I mean, PEN America, the American Press Institute, have been really great with making sure that journalists had good guidance and a space to kind of workshop ideas, because even though a lot of this may seem like a no-brainer, like, duh, you're a journalist, just tell the truth, at the same time, there was a really challenging moment, particularly early on in this election cycle, when the conversation shifted to voting by mail. Here in the United States, most of the country does not generally use voting by mail or absentee ballots. And that became such a polarizing moment, at least in terms of, from the perspective of Republicans and the former president, really honing in on false allegations of fraud, right? Like, this was a massive thing. And that was a real test for media, national and local, on how to actually engage with that conversation that was unfolding. And rightfully, we finally saw media really being able to call out the lie for what it was, because there is not an overwhelming, there isn't even like a scintilla, like a small amount of evidence that indicates there was a potential for massive fraud or anything like that. Like here in Georgia, for example, we saw a lot of attacks, particularly with the outcome of the general election. And claims, like ridiculous claims being made all over the place. But part of what, folks who did poll watching and observing and helping to do the count, part of what people found was folks who are making a lot of these claims weren't informed about the process. Right. So they did see something, but they didn't understand what they were seeing. And I know the problem is there are moments in time where the average person is often told, well, you just don't know what you're talking about. And so that can feel a certain way. Right. But a lot of this has been about feelings and not actual facts. And so local journalism plays a really strong role in helping to inform and engage people, and then also giving people the facts, the how to. Now, I have some differences of opinion on how to do that than some of our local media here in Atlanta. However, overall, I do think folks did a good job of making sure people were walking through. Now, if you choose to accept the facts or not, that's a whole different story. But we saw, across this election cycle, like the pandemic really, and I'm sure for folks, across the way, like it's probably been difficult navigating this either way in terms of government and function and how things have changed. But we really saw, local media in particular standing in and providing information. So helping to update about like, what does an absentee ballot, how does that even work, right? Or what does it mean? Because we were hearing all these issues about our postal service and some of the machinations that were going on there. And so we really saw local journalism step into a space, but we also saw that local journalism is absolutely unprepared and overwhelmed for this moment, right? Because there have been, like on the back end, there have been a lot of conversations about how to make sure journalists aren't burnt out, making sure journalists are, I mean, even just in terms of regular compensation, if you're working for national outlets, you're generally making a lot more than your local counterparts who, unfortunately, in many instances are doing a lot of the most, groundbreaking and direct work to support and benefit democracy. So I had the privilege this cycle of working with, two outlets that are POC, people of color led, women of color led outlets, but really with Scalawag, which is a regional magazine based in the South. We did a video series, and we had two other reporters who reported articles as well. So we did a video series with, organizers, other journalists, just talking about what are some of the regional issues that were happening around the election, to kind of just also help people understand more about real simple things like voter ID. I mean, for folks who were, maybe newer, because we had a surge in newer voters participating in this election cycle, or, we saw civic engagement organizations really getting more media attention this cycle than we've ever seen before. So like, what do these people do? What does that work look like? So that was kind of some of the ways that we filled in the gap in having these conversations, because information, I mean, I think everything, Emily was saying is absolutely right in terms of like how people think about combating misinformation and disinformation, but we also just don't have enough focus on getting good information out and making sure that people have good, viable, good, valid sources, reliable sources to actually share, to point to. Because the problem is when you do see something that kind of sounds right, because that's where they really get you, right? Because there's the stuff that's obviously not true. Right? This is not like some HBO show. We don't have squid coming out of the sky. Like, those are things that are obviously not true. But it is the conversations, it is the articles or the videos that have some truth mixed in with falsehood that makes it disconcerting, right? Or language. We saw like the Trump administration, we saw Republicans, and even now still, we have Republicans using language around election integrity. And of course, who wouldn't want election integrity? Who wouldn't want, so media, whether it's national or local media, but local media really plays a role in breaking down these concepts and pointing out when and how government officials in particular are not being level with us. The head of Scalawag, she just recently wrote this op-ed about getting rid of, media as a fourth estate. Media sits sometimes as if it's separate from the rest of democracy, the rest of society, but we have a real role in making sure that democracy is moving forward. When President Joe Biden gave his speech yesterday, he talked about how democracy won. But democracy won because a lot of people across many different areas of life fought very hard to make sure that democracy won. It could have been very different. And we're still fighting, right? Because we just saw an election where not only did a one-term president lose, but he went out kicking and screaming and lied the whole way, but not just lying and distorting, revved up millions of people across the country to believe that there was something stolen and taken. The percentage of people who still believe that Joe Biden was not rightfully elected, like people compare this to back in 2000 with George Bush. That was a very different time. That was my first election voting. I voted on campus with a bunch of my friends. And that was a very wild election to experience because it came down to the Supreme Court. It came down to a particular batch of votes and all discussion about had they really actually did a recount or reevaluation of all these other votes, then maybe it would have went differently. And the fine points of election law and how these things process, we need media to help guide people through those conversations. It's confusing to sit in those hearings and meetings and stuff as a person that's studying and deeply embedded in this, right? The average person. But this is also how people tune out, unfortunately. This is also how people disengage. And I'm sure this is something you all experience in the UK as well. So how do we, one, inform people and make sure they're getting good information, but then two, also keeping their attention? Because we are now in this very quick, fast, bite-sized, consumption space. And I think, unfortunately, the way in which we've allowed digital media to shift has, disincentivized having real meaningful conversations. So I do see that local media also plays a role, whether it's public radio. We also found through some of the organizing work folks were doing, folks may not have been, particularly in rural areas, may not have been as plugged into digital spaces. So like Facebook, Instagram, most the average person is usually not on Twitter in the same way. But we do know that people are listening to their local radio program. So I think we cannot, when we talk about local media, we can't leave out radio and the real strong role that radio still plays in the conversations that people are having.
Yeah, thank you, Anoa. That's a really good point. I mean, one of the things I was really surprised by some of the people I met across Georgia in particular, but actually in the Midwest too, who were not on social media, didn't have smartphones, weren't on Facebook, and still the ether of this disinformation. I met a guy who didn't vote for Trump, decided not to because he didn't really like him, and probably thought on balance Joe Biden was the right pick, but he sort of mentioned, oh yeah, there's some kind of allegation about him being a pedophile. You're like, where does this come from? It didn't come from Facebook. It didn't come, it didn't come from 4chan. It didn't come from, you didn't have that direct digital contact. So how did it get into the ether where somebody like you, who's thoughtful and fairly well informed and, didn't vote for Trump is still got this thing in your head that's buzzing around. So I think, I wanted to come to Josh now because obviously the problems with American democracy are more than just information, although we could spend the entire time talking about that. And there's a real problem with money, right? The amounts of money in politics and who's paying to play. And I think, you want us to kind of broaden this conversation out a bit, Josh, and talk about how different elements of American society have their different roles to play in trying to sort out these knotty and kind of interlinked problems. So explain the problem of money in politics and kind of explain how that kind of fits into a kind of wider view of how, what we do now, right? And how this works.
Well, sure. Thanks, Mary, and thanks, Emily, and Anoa and Peter. Great to be here with you all. I'm already learning so much, and I mean that's such a great way to frame it as well in terms of the different elements of society, because our topic here today, how Americans can fight dark money and disinformation, that's a whole of society problem, but it's interesting because different parts of society are better poised to focus on different parts of the challenge. And so if you start most broadly with the voters and the broad public, I mean, I don't mean this in a partisan way, because this is not traditionally how our political parties are organized, but because on the topic of disinformation, as Anoa said, like one of our presidential candidates in the recent election was running on a platform of lies. And so, voters did their part in choosing, in aggregate, an alternative to that. But the public's obligation continues, as Joe Biden said yesterday. In addition to referring to unity 15 times, he also talked about lies told for power and for profit. And the duty of all citizens to defend the truth and defeat lies. And on the other side of the aisle too, in some instances, we've heard Senator Mitt Romney talking about the best way to show respect for voters who are upset about the election is by telling them that the truth. So having that kind of political leadership, to the extent that we do, and we obviously need a lot more of it on both sides, but having that leadership and focus on insistence on truth, having it on both sides is honestly the single most important thing that the government can do with regards to domestic disinformation. Of course, there is a lot more, as folks have been talking about: media literacy, civic education and infrastructure, national service, transparency, data rights, antitrust regulation. There are things, but they are much more limited with regards to disinformation, as opposed to the financial challenge, where the government can do more around really important transparency, which we'll talk about in a minute. But so first on disinfo, those First Amendment and speech constraints apply obviously to the government, but not to civil society and the private sector. So they have very important roles to play, whether it's investigative journalists, local, we've been talking about watchdog organizations shining a spotlight on lies and corruption, advocates, and the broader public, to a limited degree, Congress applying pressure on the technology platforms to build up guardrails and police inauthentic behavior and manipulation, transparency around funding. Now that's clearly ramped up sharply, both in the 2020 election and even more so in recent weeks, but that needs to be explained well. It needs to be done sustainably. We have news, in Parler is trying to host itself with the domain registrar Epic, and YouTube still has this massive audience, and like OANN and Newsmax are pumped out by the cable. So there's a lot that the private sector more needs to continue to do in a sustainable way on the information environment. The government has a stronger hand to play with shining a spotlight on dark money, especially foreign, which is the subject of most of my research, but also domestic, even within the bounds of Citizens United. That's the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that allowed corporate entities to make unlimited donations through company vehicles and dark money nonprofits to super PACs, right? And that has enabled an explosion of domestic dark money. So we have this problem for both foreign and domestic. And so the first thing that Congress, I guess even here, I would split out Congress versus the administration. Congress first needs to, invest in our democracy with laws like HR 1 and SR 1, expanding voting rights, publicly financing congressional elections, forbidding partisan gerrymandering. That can help reshape our politics in a way that supports information and transparency. But most importantly, for purposes of this, conversation around dark money, is part of those laws also is making dark money nonprofits disclose the identity of their donors. Now, my research has focused on the range of tools that authoritarian regimes use to funnel money into democracies. Over 100 cases over the past decade, funneling more than $300 million into more than 33 countries, and then kind of bucketing that into the vulnerabilities and the loopholes that are exploited to do that, whether it's in-kind things of value, a big loophole in our campaign finance laws, unreported contacts with campaigns that foreign actors are able to make, going through corporate subsidiaries or shell companies, nonprofits, ads, outlets. There's all of these kind of conduits for money and information that foreign adversaries use, and it often mirrors the same infrastructure that domestic actors can use. And part of the policy strategy of how to approach that is this question of to what extent you want the solutions, which most often are shining a spotlight using transparency on the foreign actors or also the domestic actors as well. And so, like we discussed, there are some constitutional constraints that make it easier to focus on the foreign, although it's not entirely. There are a lot of things you can do when you're just talking about transparency rather than prohibitions on the domestic side too. But then in addition to the constitutional, there's also political constraints. And so when I first published this research on covert foreign money last summer, the political, the Senate, the McConnell, constraints were perhaps more binding than they are at this moment after the Georgia election. And so, there is a reasonable argument to tilt a little bit further of including the domestic actors in those transparency laws as well. And then lastly, go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to ask you about that because I think there's an intersection here, right? It's like there's information that's misinformation, right? That's sort of seeping around the system, but it's also a distortion of who gets to pay to play, right? So it's that I guess people or certain people or certain interests or certain platforms, right, have a megaphone, whereas others don't because of the way that money distorts this. So I'd love to sort of connect that point and for you to sort of join that together, I guess.
Yeah. So all of these platforms and the voices that they lift up, they have a right to free speech. They do not have a right to necessarily have the private sector pump their disinformation into millions of homes. And but even still, I mean, the question is who's going to apply that pressure on the private sector? And the Congress can do it in some certain limited ways, but them and especially the administration, there are a lot of limitations. So that's a job for civil society and watchdogs in the private sector and pressure that has happened, to a certain degree. It needs to continue. What the government can do is insist on transparency around funding, around who's behind ads, for example. The Honest Ads Act is something that, even last summer when I was thinking about this in terms of trying to separate it as much as possible, that is one area where it should just be foreign and domestic. As Honest Ads is, it would require transparency around who's funding political ads. And there are other things that the government could do in that vein as well. Looking at the 2020 election, in terms of foreign adversaries especially, but domestic too, the main vehicle of disinfo, instead of being ads like it was 4 years ago in 2016, you had all of these fringe outlets or sources, especially on the foreign side, like the Russians putting up these far left or far right little outlets and then trying to trick US freelance journalists into unwittingly aiding and abetting that, right? So these outlets, one of the ideas we had is to similarly require, instead of ad libraries by the US tech companies, outlet libraries. And then we all of a sudden find out whether the Daily Stormer actually is getting Russian crypto or, and all of these other small outlets. And there's ways you could carve it out to leave out all of the very small town newspapers and little outlets that aren't big enough to be a real vector for a national disinformation campaign, and also carve out the big publicly traded companies. And then you just got that little medium-sized subset of these blogs and things that are big enough and dangerous. So that's an interesting thing that the government can do around transparency.
Yeah, that's very good. That's very granular as well, right? That's a thing you could actually really see legislation around and practice around. I wanted to draw this because Peter Geoghegan, you've obviously written a book about how the British political conversation system influence market has imported ideas wholesale from the United States, and that's led to a warping of our political conversation, our politics. So bring us into the picture a bit about that, about what we've imported from the United States, and some of your reflections on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mary, and thanks everybody else for coming to this webinar. What I think is interesting, when we started doing this, what we call our dark money investigations at Open Democracy, looking at a lot of these issues around the role of money in politics, the role of information, disinformation, misinformation in politics, and the wider kind of world of political influence. And one of the things that kind of started to strike me when we started doing a lot of this work was just how kind of the echoes you would start to see in Britain of kind of lobbying and influence campaigns we would have seen in America, generated by things like, anonymous political donations is a really good example of that, especially going into things like think tanks, the use of loopholes in electoral law to put money into political campaigns, the same sort of stuff in terms of online advertising, the use of kind of ginger groups online, whether it's, as we saw in Britain in the kind of heated days after, in years after the Brexit referendum, we had one instance where, kind of 20-something-year-old screenwriter in Manchester was buying hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of ads on Facebook to target British MPs with like kind of hard Brexit now demands. And, at no stage was it never thought that this young man was generating these ads himself or generating income for these ads, but we still don't know where that money came from. And what I think is really interesting, I think a lot of the lessons that people like the Koch brothers, they kind of, the original big money funders of kind of on the right of American politics learned 70 years ago, or not 70 years ago, in the 70s, 50 years ago really, about how you buy the idea space of politics. And I think that's what they learned that was really interesting. Instead of thinking about, well, how do I buy politicians, instead of like thinking, right, let's try and hire a political party here, what you're trying to do is put policy ideas onto the political agenda, or put wider ideas onto the agenda, whether that idea is that the election was rigged, or that idea is I want low taxes. And sometimes those things can kind of confluence together as well. And what we've seen in Britain, I think, especially over the last 5 years, is a growing role for anonymous donations in kind of shaping the political conversation. And one of the things we write about a lot is think tanks. And just like in America, you've got these big, huge think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute. These are big, big deals in Washington. Some of these, like the Heritage Foundation, have budgets over $100 million a year, big glass sepulchral offices. Westminster's version of that are fascinating. They're way smaller. The likes of the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, similar politics, libertarian, anonymously funded, but a fraction of the income. You're talking about a couple of £1 million a year. And I first started looking at these groups, I always thought, well, these can't be that important because they don't generate that much money. But actually what you can start to see is even with a small amount of money, you can shape political conversations in really interesting ways. If you start bringing out policy reports, which is what the Koch brothers were starting to do in the 70s, you pay kind of supposedly research institutes to produce policy proposals that fit with your agenda. You get them into the media, they start getting discussed in the media. The media in Britain is very porous. I noticed in its recent report, the Institute of Economic Affairs said it had thousands, I think it was 3,000 media appearances over the previous 12 months for less than £2 million, which is an incredible return. You wouldn't get that out of a PR outlet. And similarly, what you can start to then do is, you can influence politicians then because they hear about these ideas in the media, they start to bring them up. And we've seen that really interestingly happening in Britain. Like one good example is this idea of free ports, which is now basically government policy. And this was a very fringe idea, really. It barely existed actually in Britain 4 or 5 years ago. In the wake of the Brexit referendum, a lobbying firm started getting behind it. Rishi Sunak, who's now the Chancellor of the Exchequer, wrote a report for an anonymously funded think tank called the Centre for Policy Studies, which has a kind of a history back in the Thatcher years. And 4 years later, it's official government policy, and there's a whole lobbying industry going on around free ports, and there's lots of people kind of jumping over themselves to try and become a free port. And that's just one example, I think, of the role in which anonymous money can start to have in the political conversation. I think a lot of it does, a lot of people in Britain have looked to America for this, to see how this works, to see how influence works. And I think it's similar with political donations in Britain. We kind of, again, when I started doing this work, I thought, well, like compared to America, like in America, this, we all know this huge sums. I think it was something like $6 billion was taken in donations for the presidential election alone. In Britain, it's a fraction of that. The last general election was a record donation haul for the Tories, and they took in about £40 million. And when I started looking at this, I thought, well, it can't be that important because there's much less money. But actually, what I almost think now is it's almost the opposite, because there's so little money, and we don't have a culture of giving political donations amongst the public really in Britain. It's not a big thing. And I think it's more of a thing in America. It's actually much easier to buy access. Just £50,000 a year will get you a membership of the Conservative Leaders Group. What does that mean? It means you get to go 4 times a year to a meeting with the Prime Minister and senior cabinet ministers at an undisclosed location, which there's no meeting, there's no records kept, there's no details of any political conversations. Basically you get a lot of access for 50k, which, in America, I think you'd struggle to even get into a room with somebody for that kind of cost.
Felt like lobbyists were probably laughing if they were watching this. Like 50 grand gets me to sit down with the president. Imagine that, right? But thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very important, to reflect on the fact that, and I wanted Emily to come in a bit here, which is obviously we're talking about the United States primarily, right? That's the primary discussion. This is day one of a new US administration. But of course, what happens in the US, what decisions get made about regulation of tech and et cetera, reverberate around the world. We've had audience members who say, we've got a problem in Japan. And, very much, I was very aware before this election cycle, colleagues and contacts in Kenya saying, oh, well, if Facebook gets an election wrong in the US or Britain, then maybe the wrong person wins, but here people die. So I'd love you to pick that up, Emily, and I know that your focus and research mainly in the US, but this has global implications, and yeah, speak to that.
Yeah, sure. And I think that we're getting close to the point where Facebook gets it wrong in the US. People die here as well, not perhaps in the same way, but I think it is this shared problem the point about I think the platforms are just first of all do not really understand, I think, the political landscape they are playing in, and they are trying I think to catch up, but to properly catch up will cost them a lot of money. So there's an economic disincentive for it. And I think that what you've got is the leadership of platforms in the United States saying, well, if we did X or we did Y here, it has to be a scalable solution. It has to work everywhere. That's completely wrong. Actually protecting freedom of the press, protecting the integrity of the elections, it's very contextually dependent on which territory you're in. The fact that most, Twitter has a policy for dealing with world leaders, it's not a particularly good one. It needs really tightening up. But just the fact that we don't really know. I was thinking the other day that I would love to FOIA, maybe I will FOIA all of the communications between Facebook political representatives and politicians in America. What are they promising? What are they saying that they can get? How's the targeting working? And that's the same around the world. And this idea that you have no responsibility for the consequences of your platforms. I mean, so Mark Zuckerberg's position in 2016, 2017 was, it's crazy to suggest that we can influence an election, and yet they take hundreds of millions of dollars. And to Peter's point, actually, it's amazingly cheap and cost effective to shape conversations, to swing elections on these platforms that are actually, a much more efficient advertising kind of medium than anything else. Why do we allow targeting of any politically kind of paid for material? That's a big question, because it's not like it's just the broadcasting of lies. It's like you can go and whisper a different lie into every single person's ear that you're addressing. We saw, one of my favorite questions for students is, how many ads did the Trump campaign run in the last, 6 months of 2016? And, even the highest guesses don't get even close to the 55 million that it actually was, because we're now you can algorithmically augment all of these things as well. So, whilst I think you have seen some real positive steps by trust and safety teams, I think it's positive that they took down Donald Trump's account. I still don't understand why they didn't take it down. basically sort of just after election day, when it became clear that in this contested space you were going to have a ramping up of violent rhetoric and a ramping up of the lies. So I think sort of, the fact that they can do this now means that they really do have to start examining exactly how these narratives are shaped through their platforms. And social media isn't everything. But to the point that Josh made about kind of where is the money going? How can we trace it? If you go on to sort of Facebook, anyone can self-register as a news media outlet. There's no transparency around that. There's no API that lets you examine like what those outlets actually are. We've been looking at lobbying through local news. The narrative about the stolen ballot in which actually turned out to be a cameraman's equipment came through something called the Texas Scorecard. Texas Scorecard was not a news organization until August 2020, and previously its editor-in-chief, etc., was he was at a political consultancy, which is attached to think tanks. These, in the flat space of the internet, these are all becoming the same things. And I think that, it's very boring to talk about just taxonomy and, libraries of things. The ad library is a great tool for transparency. But, there are lots of other ways in which we could actually get to look at these systems, and not just in America, but actually worldwide as well. The accountability that platforms have for enabling authoritarianism is, it's just remarkable that there is no accountability for that there isn't some way in which they are held accountable, whether it's by the UN or some other kind of international body. It's really sort of, I think, something where a small number of changes to policy internally at these companies would actually go a very, very long way. And we have to keep up the pressure. We have to, as researchers and journalists, have to keep up the pressure for them to make those reforms, because that, I think, is the only way they are going to change.
Sorry, I put myself on mute. Thank you, Emily. I wanted to, as we draw to the last bit of this, I wanted to leave on somewhat of a note of hope and optimism, because we've just talked about the way that toxic narratives can infiltrate our conversations online, offline. And we've talked a lot about the way that money can really warp that, and money can hide things and hide agendas and warp and distort special interests and influence. But really powerful, compelling, inspiring narratives can sometimes win out, right? Even despite the warping of the system. I had the honor and the privilege of spending the first 2 weeks of this year in Georgia, in the state of Georgia, where Anoa is joining us from. And I can tell you that there was absolutely toxic, just nakedly racist ads targeting one of the Democratic senators who won. The irony of Kelly Loeffler's campaigns, the fact that she was portraying this gentle pastor of America's Freedom Church as this extremist, this un-American extremist who would bring violence and chaos to America. Hours after he was elected, look what happened, right? Wasn't Raphael Warnock stoking crowds and violence and disorder. But all that, all that stuff, all that vitriol, all that horror that I heard on the airwaves in Georgia and saw online, it didn't win out, right? Because there was a very powerful, compelling narrative that, as far as I could witness it, and Anna can speak to this further, was community-led, bottom-up, years of organizing, authentic, connected, well-organized, inspiring. Tell us about that, because I think that's a really important part of the picture, is just telling a better story.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. My daughter voted for the first time this cycle, and she's just like, look, I'm a pro by now. We voted like 5, I forget how many times we voted at this point in time by the time we were voting for the runoff. But I remember watching the debate with my 19-year-old, and it was in December, and Kelly Loeffler just kept repeating, he's a radical leftist, Marxist, whatever. And my daughter, she just all of a sudden let out this laugh. And talking to more younger folks, right? Because we had this surge of younger people who came in into the process as well. It just sounded so ridiculous and wild to them, right? But I think what you just said about telling a better story, it was telling a better story, but also connecting that politics, connecting the positions directly to issues that were impacting people right now. We're still in the middle of a global pandemic. I mean, that has severely curtailed a lot of the way we're used to living and existing in life, not to mention we just had 900,000 people, or 900,000 people filed for unemployment, close to 1 million people filed for unemployment in a week, which is, astronomical for here. That's unheard of. Well, I mean, in recent weeks it's not unheard of, but it's a new thing. So the state of healthcare in the state of Georgia has not expanded Medicaid as many other states have. So we have a large number of people who remain uninsured or people who are underinsured. So there are all these different, concerns and considerations that are directly impacting people's lives. So organizations like Black Voters Matter and the New Georgia Project and Asian Americans Advancing Justice and so many others, Mahente, made these very direct connections. We also saw, really, awesome, candidates who were willing to listen and be held accountable and be pushed when they needed to, but it wasn't, because there's a lot of conversation around accountability, right? Like, oh, just wait until we get them elected, we'll worry about it later. But the problem is, if you worry about it later, you've already missed the window really to put that pressure on, because the people who have been able to buy the access, whether because they're high dollar donors or just because they're in those direct political spaces, already having those conversations, they already have their white papers, their policy demands, et cetera. So people, organizations, grassroots have to build that accountability, build those expectations into the process of supporting people, and just make it very clear, like, this is what is at stake for our communities. This is what we need to do to move forward. The other thing that I thought was really amazing about what was happening here in Georgia, and it's not just Georgia, we see similar conglomerations of organizations come together in various other places. We saw the amazing, win in Arizona during the general election. And, even the effort to flip back Wisconsin was because of the collective effort of different organizations around the state. So we see something similar here that develops in Georgia, in the Southeast. We have Black voters, yes, doing the amazing job that Black voters did, but we also had a growing population of Latino and Asian American voters that were not just engaged and turned out, but engaged in a really authentic, in-community manner. So we saw, stuff in language in Spanish, but we also saw people doing things in language in Korean and other Asian languages that was really important and made people feel a part of the process. So people could actually tell their stories or ask questions. One of the things that I really have found as a story that was really important was a state rep, B. Nguyen, who is first generation Vietnamese American, talked about canvassing back in 2018 with her sister, and they were at a door. It was an older Vietnamese man. They were able to talk to him in their native language, and he had so many questions. And one of the things that he said was, people, in English, and he spoke English, but it wasn't his first language, so he wasn't as comfortable talking to people. But people light up when you talk to them, when you engage with them in a way that they're comfortable and they understand. And so there was a real effort to make sure that people's issues, people's feelings, and people's communities were heard. Again, feelings are not facts, but they do matter in terms of the way in which we engage with people. And we saw in the general election, we saw local, wins. We saw 2 new sheriffs at the county level elected in Georgia that are willing to roll back the 287G program. That is a program that is a cooperation agreement between ICE and local law enforcement. And that is, it has to deal with a lot of just wrong deportations and detention practices that are happening. Those 2 specific seats alone will curtail a lot of that unnecessary interaction that people have had with ICE over the past several years since those agreements were put into effect. So electing just those 2 people made a huge impact for communities in Cobb and Gwinnett County and other folks in the metro area. And so we're seeing this continue building on, right? We had some momentum in 2018, although Stacey Abrams did not win as governor for all the machinations and stuff that went on in that race. We did see a shift in new people elected to the state house and state senate. We saw the same now moving forward in 2020. We unfortunately had a 3rd race on the ballot for the runoff election. It was a statewide race for the Public Service Commission. Public Service Commission deals with utilities. We have some of the highest utility bills in the country here in Georgia. I think we're like number 2 or number 3. We're somewhere up there in high utility bills, particularly when we're talking about rural areas, older homes that do not have weatherization or modernization. And so we unfortunately did not win that race, but Daniel Black became the closest in the last several cycles in that race, right? So we need to do better about making sure these other seats have the same attention and energy and effort. I mean, it's not going to be quite the same as the presidential election, but we need people to understand the importance of these local seats as well. So, but we saw this really amazing broad network of people, and it's really not about ego. A lot of people nationally and internationally will credit Stacey Abrams. Stacey is a phenomenal visionary, but she's also a person who understands her spot in this overall ecosystem that exists and recognizes that it's not just her. And she has, actively lifted up other organizations, as does the organization she found, Fair Fight. So there is an amazing ecosystem of folks who are doing this work down here, and they continue to do it because they understand that it's not just these single standalone cycles, it's a year-round cyclical. Each one builds on to the next one and moving forward. So that's, I think, part of the story that we've seen here in Georgia.
Thank you so much. And it's interesting, when I was leaving Atlanta, I spoke to two different people, one from Louisiana and one from Texas. And they were like, oh yeah, we're a few years behind. We've only been doing this. The lady from Louisiana was like, we've only been doing this 6 years. Give us another 4 or 5, we'll do it. And the same with Texas, which was really fascinating. But I think that it's interesting because as we draw this to an end, I think what I've heard from lots of you in different ways actually is that the local and the context specific really, really matters. That there are big, legislative, national, supranational legislative and regulatory things which need to happen. There is policy and there is law and there is regulation at that level. But actually, what Emily was saying about, the whole fallacy and the perspective that tech platforms have, whereas if they have a solution for misinformation, they need to be able to scale it. Completely the opposite is true, in the sense that you need to get more local, more context specific, understand that and learn from it in different places and in different ways and in different contexts, but contextualize it for that local, for that specific, for that audience, for that country or region. And I think that that's something, when you take a global view of massive problems like disinformation and dark money, it sometimes gets lost. So thank you for painting that picture of hope for us. It certainly helped my 2021 get off to a good start, despite everything that was going on. Thank you to all the panelists today. It's been a really interesting conversation. I'm sure we could have gone on for much longer, but thank you all for joining us. And thanks to everyone in the audience for all your questions and participation. If you'd like to join, sign up to our newsletter, Julian will put it in the chat, and have a wonderful evening, morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks so much.